Never mind about the intro vid, because I think I just had a hiccup on my end. So we're just going to jump right to the chase. How you doing, everybody? It's your boy, Wardy. That is Jolly Olive, one of the best baseball YouTubers out there. Also an avid Mets fan. And today, Jolly and I are going to be breaking down all the latest in this offseason. It's going to be a different show than what we've done previously. Jolly, actually, a couple years ago, and I think the first time I had the privilege of having him on the show, we did a complete Mets offseason outlook, and that was like in the kind of the beginning stages of the offseason 2 years ago. We're going to use the same template and format again, but this time we're going to go through each position for the Mets currently for their active roster. What do they currently have there? What is their depth? And ultimately, how are they shaping up for the 2024 season? Along with exactly why most of you are probably watching this, what can the Mets still do when we're looking at DH, when we're looking at bullpen? And most recently, given a report that came out earlier today, they may still be in the market for some help in said rotation. So Jolly and I are going to be sharing our perspectives, opinions, and ultimately what external options could be feasible for the club and so much more. But again, I appreciate everyone first chiming in live on our replay. Shout out to Dave, shout out to John, shout out to Dominic. Dave, I'm going to message you very soon, my friend. Thank you so much for your generosity. I have a question regarding the things you sent. That's why I got to make sure I message you too. But thank you so much in advance. Yoshima, every show is a W, but this one will be an even bigger W. How are you two? I'm doing fantastic. But Jolly, how are you doing today, my friend?
I'm doing great, man. Happy New Year to all my Mets fans out there. We got some interesting reports today. We got some actual major league signings recently that we get to talk about, which is pretty fun. And it seems like the offseason is finally starting to actually get its legs a little bit. Like Teoscar happened. I'm sure more things will start to trickle down later this week. So I'm feeling good. I'm starting to get a little bit of baseball fever again. I know that, the reception to a lot of the Mets moves are probably tepid so far, but it still excites me as a baseball fan. And I'm excited to dive into this whole goddamn thing with you.
Yeah, let's dive into the whole thing because, this offseason, most certainly for every fan, even the fans who knew what to expect pretty much the entire time, everyone's pretty much underwhelmed. And that goes in large part losing out on Yamamoto, which was not because of a lack of effort on the Mets end. It's just the harsh reality when you operate in an offseason where, yeah, you don't like too much of what's currently available out there. You don't want to overspend on guys when you know there's a lot available next offseason. But there was just one or two unique guys where they're like that pure exception. He was that. Now that that isn't happening, we're kind of following suit with what the remainder of the offseason was expected to be, and it isn't to the fans' liking, a lot of them. However, things still may be changing, and they're certainly going to be adding more, which means DFAs and trades are inevitably coming. For those that don't know, the Mets 40-man is pretty much filled up now, so anyone else that they add, and they need to, at least one or two more relievers, possibly another starter, DH, hopefully they can add there. I'm assuming the outfield is pretty much done at this point, and we'll get into that shortly. They still need to add at least 4 or 5 more guys, which means moves are going to be had. So be on the lookout for that all, and again, we'll try to get to some of your comments before the end of the live show. It's greatly appreciated, but Jolly, let's start off with this, okay? Let's start with the catching position. Probably the easiest position that we can get into. I don't think that there's a whole lot that needs to be harped on here. We know that heading into this season, Francisco Alvarez will be the Mets' number 1. Number 2 will be Omar Narvaez. Now, my question to you, Jolly, again, for those that don't know, is kind of an Omar Narvaez doppelganger on the side, too. I got to ask,
It's an
where do you...
OG meme. Oh my God. It's
Yes.
way back.
Yeah, I got to ask you, where do you see Omar Narvaez with the Mets? Do you think he's for certain going to be their backup catcher this year? Because I understand injuries went into play with, his demise last year, but also he was very underwhelming for a guy that's going to make 7 to 8 mil this season. Do you think that he's for certain going to be the Mets backup catcher, or could Steve Cohen do his latest, I'm going to eat your contract and part with you because there's really no reason to have you here at these dollars right now? Where do you stand regarding Omar?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, from a wider scope, I feel like every Mets fan kind of had the same reaction to the contract when it was initially signed, which was kind of why so much for Omar Narvaez. And I saw the upside at the beginning, but
Right.
then injuries got in the way. I don't know if people remember, but those first 2 weeks we had him, or even I think it was just the first week before he got hurt. He was like one of the best hitters in the lineup.
He
With
was against
Narvaez,
Miami in particular. I
right?
remember that
Yeah, and then
series.
and
Yeah.
then the Brewers who said a little bit. For him, it's kind of a rock and a hard place because you're not in a position where you can eat the money and trade him for something of value. You'd just be in a Cano situation in a much lesser degree where you're just eating the money to get him off the roster. But with that being said, I don't really see a viable backup behind him in Tyler Heidemann, who's on the 40-man beside Alvarez and Narvaez. So I do think he starts the year on the roster unless Stearns can get some sort of value for him, which I don't really think is there, just because the catching position is actually in a pretty good spot considering the last 5 years of catching talent at the major league level. But all eyes are going to be on Francisco Alvarez. He's one of these guys where I look at his numbers from last year and I'm perplexed at how poor they ended up with the 209 average, 95 OPS plus, because he just felt like he was so good for most of the year. He just tailed off really bad. And I think August or something like that. Yeah, August was his really bad month. But the plan is going to be Alvarez at the front. You get a veteran catcher as your backup in Narvaez. I don't think it's a bad situation to be in for the Mets. It's just the price tag that really kind of irks you in the end, because right now, as it stands, he's one of the higher paid players on this team, which is pretty perplexing considering how much the Mets have spent. So I think that's a solid situation for them to be in. And if you can get anything from it at the deadline, it's a massive win.
Yeah, and I don't know if you saw, Jolly, but a couple months ago I did a video on like 5 Mets who won't return this season, and the biggest question mark I had in said video was Omar Narvaez, because it's like, okay, the Mets have shown this willingness to eat salary, even with James McCann. Let's not forget, just a year ago, they did exactly that. So it wouldn't shock me if they found themselves in the same category. And we knew why the Mets signed Narvaez to begin with. This was a veteran catcher, of course, that can hit from the left side of the plate, which is a little bit appealing too. Of course, he's a fellow Venezuelan, so he's able to kindle that relationship with Francisco Alvarez better than some others. And knowing that he is too a fellow guy at the backstop position is certainly appealing. So those were all the upsides. We knew that at his best, he can hit for a solid contact, not known for too much defensive upside. And going through the numbers as well for Omar, I know it was a fairly small sample size. He was pretty brutal both offensively and defensively, to the point where it was factoring into ball games. So, I mean, is Tomas Nido still under contract right now? Is he still in AAA for the Mets?
The forgotten man. Where's
Yeah,
Tomas Nido
no
at?
one
I
has talked
believe.
about Tomas Nido since
He's
he
still at
cleared.
AAA. So Tomas Nido has no options left. So if he does make the club, he's either staying with the club or he's getting DFA'd, which I don't think is a situation the Mets want to run into.
Right.
But I think he'll get some run at some point, that someone's going to get hurt or someone's going to play poorly enough to where he's going to become necessary. And I like that he's still stashed down there.
Yeah, no, so do I. So for the catching position, Francisco Alvarez, Omar Narvaez, that is likely what we're rolling in for the 2024 season. Before we get on to the next position, what is the biggest thing you're looking for Francisco Alvarez in particular this season versus what we saw in his rookie campaign?
A little bit of consistency. I mean, there's only so much you can ask of a guy that's 21 years old playing arguably the hardest position on the field. So for him, it's going to be, not just always trying to hit the long ball, although when he does, it goes far and it's a very fun sight to behold. A little bit of plate discipline, 34 walks to 110 strikeouts last year. That's about what you might expect from a kid playing in the lead. So I'm hoping that he can upgrade from that 8.0 walk percentage, maybe get those strikeouts down. But for him, it's just, keep working hard, keep improving, keep that upward trajectory, and use this year as a year to develop. I mean, the Mets are kind of paving the way for a lot of their younger guys to either establish themselves or continue to better themselves, and none are in a better spot than Francisco Alvarez, who already has a lot of these tools set in place. He was one of the highest guys in barrel percentage at 84th percentile, 95th percentile in catcher framing, so he's a stud back there.
Yep.
He still have things to improve on, but again, 21 years old. The world is his oyster still. So I'm looking for him to take things slow, stay healthy this entire year, get to know Kodai Senga a little bit better, get more comfortable catching him, because foreseeable future, that's a nice battery you want to have in the Mets uniform. And above all else, just keep having fun, keep that smile going. Don't let anybody tell you to not dance around the bases, and keep doing your thing.
Alvarez puts it best by the tattoo he has right below his neck. The best. I'm expecting that from Francisco this season. I almost said El Kraken. My goodness gracious. Don't get me wrong. I remember seeing El Kraken. Funny enough, I was behind home plate one of the few games he played for the Mets, and that I think it was the Guardians doubleheader earlier this season, whatever it was. But regardless, El Troll is what we're going to go with as we now transfer from the catching position to now first base. I really don't think anything needs to be added there either. Basically, the question is, do you think Pete Alonso will be the Mets starting first baseman in 2024?
I mean, I hope so, right? Who really knows at this point? The rumors had a ton of steam at the beginning of the offseason, and they've really dissipated in the past 4 or 5 weeks, which I think is a welcome sign. But it's also a matter of the fact that I don't think the camps are talking right now. I think the Mets are doing a lot behind the scenes of establishing their depth and all that stuff. Someone in the chat actually just mentioned the Epler investigation too. That's another thing that had a lot of steam 5 weeks ago and hasn't had any since. So the Mets, it's been a weird offseason for them because it hasn't exactly been quiet, but it's been kind of going in waves. And the Alonso negotiation is kind of all part of that. We saw the Morel rumor where that was going to be the centerpiece of the package from the
I didn't
Cubs.
acknowledge that for 1 second. Yeah,
It
when that was
never
happening.
really came together. It
Yeah.
was I mean, if you're going to do something like that, I guess that's a step in the right direction, but it never really felt like it was a real possibility. So now the question becomes, what kind of contract year is Pete Alonso going to have? Is he going to have that insane Judge year where he goes off, puts forth his best campaign, and earns the money that he wants? Or is it going to be something where it affects his play and he's not able to produce at the highest level? I'm going to be very interested to keep tabs on that. But as far as I'm concerned, come opening day, Pete Alonso is going to be on this roster hitting fourth, playing first base. It's just a matter of, is he under contract by then or not?
Right. And gut tells me he's not going to be extended whatsoever. I think that this will certainly be a walk year for him. And, hopefully wishful thinking, the Mets can bring him back the same way they did with WardyNYM just an offseason ago. It's certainly
Right.
not an easy thing with Alonso's caliber and also him in a walk year. I mean, I know that he naturally can give you 45 to 50 plus bombs a season, but who knows? With added incentive, we could see even a different look at Pete Alonso than what we
You
saw.
never
And
know.
mind you, aside from the bombs, he did have an underwhelming season post-injury. Even before that, there wasn't that same consistency that you saw in 2022. My biggest gripe with Alonso this past season was just his inability to spread the field. I mean, we saw
Yeah.
that so well by taking advantage of the shift in years prior that, similar to Jeff McNeil, once there was basically a little shift in implementation, these guys kind of figured, okay, I can go back to being the pull happy hitter that I was, and I'm going to have success that way. That was not the case for both Alonso, McNeil, and others. And even Luis Guillorme struggled to go oppo like he normally did. That was
Right.
a recipe for disaster for this offense. But Pete, we all know he's likely going to be starting the year with the Mets, and hopefully he'll be finishing his career with them too. I think the only added thing could be, okay, who else could play the first base position? We know Mark Vientos can get reps there should he be on the roster to begin the year. We know that if the Mets sign a Justin Turner, he can actually get reps there if you want to give Alonso some off days at DH. We'll get into a little bit more on Justin later in the show, but that's where things are shaking up there. I do see Stark Raving Sports, probably my man Mike in the live chat. Shout out to you, Mike. For those that don't know, Mike came out with a video today regarding both Mets and Jets fandom. So if you're a Mets and a Jets fan, look no further. Check out Stark Raving Sports in their latest
Sure,
video
it's a
today.
very happy video.
Yeah, it's always happy. I literally put in
It
the
was a good
comments,
time.
cue the Patrick meme of so much pain, it hurts. Eric with a $20 donation that we'll get into a little bit later in the show, asking our thoughts about who would we put in prospect and players category of untouchable, trade in the right deal, or trade in any deal? That's a great question, and I'm going to hold that off till as we wrap up things once we answer more of the show segment. But now let's get on from first base. We're going to talk a bit about second base. And I think second base is a bit more interesting to the eye than maybe you think as the average Mets fan. And the reason why I say that is Jeff McNeil's under contract. Jeff is expected to play the bulk of games at second base this season, as long as guys can stay healthy, which we all know is a big what if. However, knowing that the Mets have at least added more defensive depth for the outfield, you'd have to imagine Jeff will get more time at second base than not. But then you have a couple guys that ETAs are of this season, that being in Luis Angel Acuna, and more famously, you could argue, Jet Williams. Where do you stand with the second base position for the Mets? Do you anticipate Jeff to pretty much round out second base throughout the entirety of the year, or could we see some changes midseason?
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion, and it kind of contributes to a little bit of the outfield discussion too, because that's where Jeff would
Right.
end up if he's not playing second base. I mean, we both know that Jeff is a plus pretty much wherever he plays at this point in his career. I'm going to get the exact number. I mean, it was positive, outs above average, in second base, left field, and right field last season. So you're getting a good defender wherever you put him. And the Mets have crafted a pretty decent outfield platoon here with the signings of Bader, trading for Tyrone Taylor. They've given themselves options at center field in the corner outfield positions, insurance for Starling Marte. And like you mentioned, the backup options are the top kids for second base, Jet Williams and Luis Angel Acuna. So I think we're going to see McNeil predominantly at second base. I think that's where his value is at its best and probably where he's most comfortable, although he looks pretty much comfortable anywhere in the field. And for him, we mentioned before how Alvarez and Alonso's numbers kind of ended up in an ugly place at the end of last year. McNeil's numbers look a lot better than you would guess if you watched him the entire season.
Strong.
He finished very strong with a good September. The batting average got to a nicer place, didn't strike out a ton still. So for him, it's, steady the momentum, continue to try and prove you were worth that preseason extension. And don't get comfortable, because a lot of change is coming to this organization. I'm pretty sure if Alonso's on the table for trade or extension talks, then maybe a guy like McNeil might be too. He might be worth a lot, especially if he's able to turn it around. So I'm hoping to see a little bit of a bounce back for him, become the force in the lineup that he once was alongside Starling Marte, and really man that second base position, because I don't think they're going to need him to play a ton of outfield unless they need to get crafty.
I felt this way about Jeff pretty much since the beginning. Again, I've been a big fan of McNeil throughout his entire career. Both you and I had the luxury of meeting Jeff and Alonso at his charity event earlier in 2023. And having said that all, I do not believe for even 1 second that Jeff McNeil will finish his contract with the New York Mets. I
Interesting.
don't see it happening whatsoever. I think he's absolutely going to be a trade chip for them as soon as the season. Again, not that I necessarily wish it, but knowing that the Mets have a logjam here, of course, this all changes if the Mets trade one of Acuna or Williams to a degree, in my viewpoint. And that very well could happen if they acquire one of the starters out there via trade that we're going to get into a little bit later in the show here. But with the assumption that the Mets have this logjam right now, knowing that Williams' upside is certainly there, basically the biggest question with him is, yes, he's very much a contact bat. How will his size transition at the MLB level? Of course, you can reference the most famous man of all in Jose Altuve, but that is such, you could really say that's an anomaly of a pick, right? A lot of guys around those heights, including myself, just do not thrive well at the MLB level, right? So evaluating what the Mets could be doing here for second base, Williams, I really think there's a great chance that he performs so well to the point where it's like you have to find room to call him up, because especially this year is the year where you have the leash for some of these kids versus 2025. It's kind of like now or never in a way for this Mets team. It's a prime time for them to try to see what they have in these guys. Luis Angel Acuna, I have a lot of upside into, like a lot of belief that he's going to perform well, but he was a little underwhelming post-trade with the Mets. Yes, his ETA is this year, but he's not in the current position the way that Jet Williams is for certain to start in AAA, probably, again, be an on-base god, and then be with the Mets before we know it, potentially by the halfway mark, if not sooner, of the season. So having said all that, again, I love Jeff McNeil, but I would not be shocked if the Mets do part ways with him at some point before that contract's conclusion. I know that he's got a couple years left on said deal. Tony with the $5 donation, thank you so much. It says, it's great to see my two favorite YouTubers. Appreciate that, Tony. I've watched you guys from when you had only a few subs. It's great to see how you guys have grown. It's funny Tony says that, because Jolly, every time that we talk, one of the few things that I remember is when you were back, doing some live shows on Jolly Olive, whether you were doing playing some games on your computer or whatever. Like, you have to be in the trenches. The OGs remember that time with Jolly.
But when you mentioned the Omar Narvaez meme, I was like, there were 15 people in that chat. If you're one of them, you're a true OG.
Exactly. And now here you are. You're going to hit 100,000 subscribers before you know. And congratulations in advance.
Don't jinx it.
Awesome. I'm not. Why jinx the inevitable? That's what I say. Well, you think things are going to stand at 99.9 for like a decade?
I don't know. Subscribe, I guess.
I don't know. Fuck it. Whatever. All right. So we talked about second base. Now let's get into, because we were mentioning it, outfield. This is a really interesting outfield construction for the Mets. Obviously not the sexiest one, not my favorite by any means, and I do have a decent amount of concerns with it. I want to know what yours are too, but you see right now, as the season begins, we're going to have Brandon Nimmo toying from center to left because the Mets acquired one of the best defensive center fielders in the game when healthy, and Harrison Bader. Again, when healthy, a big question mark. Of course, the Mets, in typical fashion, bring in another outfielder that, again, can struggle to stay on the field, but when he is on the field, he is, to your point, I know you emphasize this further, very much a platoon type option, righty versus lefty. Marte, if he can stay healthy, hopefully he'll have a nice bounce back here in right field. But again, I have a lot of reservations with Starling Marte, as do we all. But Brandon Nimmo going to get some time in the left, which will be good for his legs, his longevity. I don't hate that at all based on matchups. Tyrone Taylor, again, I think is going to have a similar sample size with what he did the past couple years with the Brewers, coming in some interesting situations, either as a defensive replacement or also getting some starts. The Mets the past couple years under Buck Showalter, of course, had this platoon option, whether it was Travis Jankowski and Mark Canha, whether it was Tim LaCastro and some others, whether it was most recently Mark Canha, Tommy Pham. I anticipate them to have still a platoon type option with the current outfield makeup. So my question to you here is, how much playing time do you anticipate a guys like Bader and Tyrone Taylor to get in particular? And do you think that this offense, this outfield has enough depth to carry them throughout the season until potentially a Drew Gilbert is ready to handle left field, maybe a couple months into the season?
Yeah, I think I have this on the brain because I just did a piece on the 2021 Giants, which, for those who don't know, that team won 107 games, and they basically had two different
Ridiculous.
lineups that they could execute at any time, one for righties, one for lefties. And I think the big reason why they were so successful, out of lucking into everyone staying healthy, is the fact that they were able to load manage their players very properly. It was coming off the COVID year, so a lot of their vets had a fresh start, all that kind of thing. The Mets aren't afforded that luxury, but at the same time, I think they're in a good spot to load manage a lot of their outfielders, which has been a demanding and sometimes struggling position for this team the past few years. And a big piece of this has to be protecting Nimmo, who is going to be in, I think, year 2 of an 8-year deal. And you want to get as much as you can out of him, because last year he looked like he was worth every penny. It's kind of a wasted year, unfortunately. But Brandon Nimmo proved that he is worth that money. He is that guy. So you want to do your best to give him time in left field, ease up those legs, because before 2022, he was a very injury prone player, and I'm sure the Mets don't want to return to that. So you supplement them with talent. And I like the talent that they picked up, especially if you can also manage a guy like Bader and put him in positions to succeed. He was kind of caught in a tough place with the Yankees, where he was the centerpiece of a trade and he was expected to be an everyday player. And I really just don't think that's the way that he ever profiled. And I think he did the best with the situation that he was in. But at the end of the day, this is a guy that provides defensive and speed upside. And if you put him against lefties, he can showcase a little bit of that pop. And then as for Tyrone Taylor, I like the pickup. I like him as a throw-in in that trade. I still think that's one of the better moves made by any team this offseason, to get Hauser in that as well. For Taylor, it's going to be, work on that play discipline, man. He had 8 walks in 81 games last year. That's not
Holy
going to
shit,
fly.
Ahmad Rosario, calm
Yeah.
down. My goodness.
Seriously, that's literally the exact player that I thought of, because like there are tools here for sure. There are definitely things that are impressive about his game, but none of it's going to matter if your on base percentage is 250. There's no way you can be a productive player.
Right.
So I'm hoping that's going to be a point of emphasis for him, because when he's right, he's a power guy, he's a contact guy. He had some nice moments in the playoffs as well.
Fast, very fast too. There's a
Fast as
lot of
well, sneaky
appealing
fast.
aspects to his
I
game for
believe
sure.
the same sprint speed as Bader potentially. I might have that
Probably,
mixed
I
up,
think
but up there.
Tyrone's around 85 or
Yeah.
so in his sprint speed, and the power, as you mentioned, is certainly there. He's a big fastball hitter, so it's going to come down to not only his discipline with when it comes to getting some more walks, but also his eye with these off speed and breaking pitches. He has yet to
Yeah.
really. He's had nice little stretches of brilliance with the Milwaukee Brewers, but again, they've been small spurts. I'm not asking for the guy to be a 30 home run, lock to be our everyday outfielder, because that's not what we brought him in for. But
Right.
he's younger, has upside, has legs, is a plus defender too. He's exactly the kind of fourth outfielder that the Mets were kind of in the market for to begin with. And now he may find himself in a little bit more of a premier position, should, of course, there be either inconsistencies, injuries, because unfortunately this year's outfield market has just not been appealing. Teoscar
Yeah.
Hernandez, as you mentioned, signed a 1-year, $23 million deal with $8.5 million deferred. He wasn't signing a deal like that with anyone else. And if you're him,
Yeah.
I don't blame him whatsoever for doing that contract, because he's betting on himself, and one of the deepest, if not the deepest lineup in baseball, you're telling me, has the best odds to win a World Series in the offseason at least, and then
Yeah.
can bank for a long-term contract next offseason. How can you go wrong? Jorge Soler, who I would absolutely love, that we'll talk about more shortly, the guy can't field. Okay, if you're bringing him in, he's going to DH 9 out of 10 times. At least
Correct.
that's what it should be, because he is that bad defensively to the point where it can impact games. Think about
Right.
Marcano when
And
he
the way
got.
that Stearns crafts rosters, he emphasizes athleticism, defense, speed. These tools matter in run prevention. That's something that he built the Brewers' success on.
Exactly. And Soler, I think of Marcano when he got the ball lost in the lights in Atlanta. Like, imagine that lack of defense on a more frequent basis is what you're
Right.
getting in Jorge Soler, right? So,
Right.
again, would love him, but not for the outfield position more than likely. So, that is what the Mets outfield makeup is looking like at this point in time. And now that we mention it, let's jump to one of the more juicy topics, the DH position, okay? Because there's been a lot
Okay.
of conflicting reports. Are the Mets going to be adding there? Are they going to stay put? We hear Andy Martino famously trying to shoot down any optimism by saying it's possible but not plausible. Thank you, Sandy Alderson. So my question to you, Jolly, is you got 3 names out there. 3 names, pretty much the only names the Mets are likely going to consider, unless we find out, hey, we just got Dylan Cease and Eloy Jimenez. Okay, that's dope.
That'd be perfect.
You got Justin Turner, you got Jorge Soler, you got JD Martinez. They all make sense for the team for either similar or some varying different reasons. Do you want the Mets to go out of their way to land one of those 3, or would you prefer that they stay in-house, which is very much a possibility with Mark Vientos, DJ Stewart? And furthermore, which of the 3 is most appealing for you?
Yeah, I did a little like fun mock-up offseason just on my couch one day, and Turner was the name that I included in there as the DH. And there were some interesting replies, either supporting it or going against it. They are three good options that would all benefit this lineup greatly. I think if you're going for what would better the team cost efficiency wise, it's probably JD Martinez. I think he's your best option here. He still looks like he's got it. It looks like reconnecting with his old hitting coach last year in LA did wonders for him. But I don't think the Mets are signing a DH. I think if anything, they'll find a bat in a trade if that comes together. But I think it's going to be an in-house solution because I think they
Really?
want to get younger guys a look. I think that if it hasn't happened yet with a lot of the bats that have flown off the board, I don't think it's going to happen at all because it's just a weak hitters market. And like we've said many times, they're in this weird 1 year window where they're not fully committing, but they're kind of dipping their toe in with acquiring talent from across the league via trade and these smaller 1 year deals. And there's just not a DH outside of Turner that profiles into that 1 year deal. And I don't know that the Mets are fully committed to him. So I would fully expect to see like a Mark Vientos, DJ Stewart kind of platoon. I mean, they gave DJ Stewart that vote of confidence, like, hey, thanks for providing a spark these last 2 months. Here, come back next year and let's see if it's for real. And then Vientos is a guy that they've kind of been banking on the power to come through. It would have been a much more fun discussion if a guy like Ronnie Mauricio was still in the cards to kind of push people around and shift people into that DH spot, but he's not a factor for 2024 anymore. So it falls down to really just those two names. You might see a guy like Marte get DH time because I'm sure they want to protect him as much as possible. If Marte is healthy, that's a very productive bat, and you have plenty of outfield options now. So that's something that Mets fans may not be considering, but very much may be a possibility as we're in year 3 of this 4-year deal, and they're just trying to get anything they can out of him at this point. But yeah, I think it's going to be in-house options. I think they're going to do their best to work in that load managing that I mentioned before with giving Nimmo rest days, giving him time in left, putting Bader in center. Marte sits a day. Tyrone Taylor goes to play right. Like they're giving themselves options. McNeil might go play left, all this kind of thing. And signing a DH to take that spot and only have that spot might be alluring if they hit 20, 30 home runs for you, but it takes away from the roster management that I think Stearns is prioritizing right now with versatility and giving the manager as many options as possible. It's a tough situation to be in because obviously you want your DH to be the best hitter in your lineup. And you could profile Alonso there at some point. It's not that time yet. We didn't even mention other bats that like Rhys Hoskins is kind of one of these weird fringe options who could play first, who could DH. But
Jock
I do think at
Peterson
the end of the
too,
day,
if you want to do it a little
Jock
bit lesser
Peterson, who
degree.
I just think would be great at Citi Field, but I just don't think it's ever going to happen. I think it's going to be an in-house solution, and it's not sexy, but I think for what the Mets are trying to craft for 2024, it probably makes the most sense.
See, there's a lot of points that you bring up that are absolutely valid, and I'm going to get into the Marte comment in a minute because I was thinking about that quite a bit, towards the end of last season. We're going all the way back to, but before I do, I'm going to be the playing devil's advocate the other way around. So you're for internal, not necessarily for, but you expect it. So I'm going to go with the expectation that they'll add externally. And the reason for this is a couple things. And Ronnie Mauricio is a factor here. I think a bit bigger than maybe what some people realize. The reason why I say that is there is no coincidence that as soon as Ronnie went down, the next day or so, not even, we found out that the Mets are looking to add a bat, whether it's more so just a third base option or a guy that again can kind of come in, help out the kids, but also playing either on an everyday position or off the bench. Turner makes more sense than not for the obvious fact of you're getting a veteran that, of course, knows what it's like to play in Citi Field. Yes, he's not getting any younger, but he's coming off of a career-high season RBIs. I know he was playing in Boston. That definitely played a factor in ripping all those bad boys to the left off the Green Monster. Still, though, he's still a very productive bat at this point in his career. And if the Mets brought him in, you're getting a guy that can kind of help mentor Brett Beatty should he still be on the roster and say not be dealt, for example, for the 2024 season. Mark Vientos, same applies, but you're getting someone that can not only give you immediate protection at the DH position, where you're locked at around 20 home runs and 80-plus RBIs next season with the solid OPS, versus having a Mark Vientos and DJ Stewart, where while they may certainly have upside of 20-plus home runs and doing exactly that, that's such a big question mark. And I know that this is a year where you kind of want to see what you have, so I understand the argument for and against here, but I think there's also something to be said about the Mets' lack a proper usage with the DH position since it became
Right.
universal. Are we
Right.
really going to continue this, or are we going to actually try to go with a nice short-term stopgap option that is automatically going to make this Mets offense better in 2024 in large part than maybe what it was all throughout 2023? So Justin Turner's ability to play in the field at times, you don't want him playing there much. He only played 7 games at third base last season. Played more at second and first than anywhere else. Again, giving some off days for Alonso, don't hate that. I don't want him at second base. I think that's a recipe for disaster. I remember a play in particular where he tried to turn it out, and it was horrendous. I saw with Boston last season. So
Right.
again, he might not be the best fielder at this point in his career at the young age of 39, but he's still someone that can give you power protection outside of Alonso, Lindor, Alvarez. Yes, he's not as sexy of a name as maybe JD Martinez, I'll get into in a second, but he really kind of fits the mold a bit more, I think, given what the Mets are looking for. And David Stearns does have a good relationship with them. He's tried acquiring him in the offseasons past during his time in Milwaukee, so there's some internal connections there. JD Martinez, absolutely, I think is the best short-term fit. You're getting a guy, and this goes for Turner too. I don't know how you feel, if you're the same or different, Jolly, but I'm under the impression that should the Mets land either of these grizzled vets, I don't anticipate them to have the same stat line they did last year. I'm expecting a drop-off, especially at a pitcher's park like Citi Field. I know Dodger Stadium can certainly be hard to hit there at times too, so I'm keeping that in mind. But having said that, JD had, of course, over 30 bombs past season, like 33, 100 plus RBIs. Again, just under what was he? Just under a 900 OPS, right? So even if he drops 100 OPS points, say he's right around 800, gives you 25 home runs, gives you 85 RBIs. Who's complaining about that if you're a Mets fan? You finally get protection short-term at the DH position. Same thing with Justin Turner. You're not going to get his Boston stat line, but if you get north of 20 home runs, 80-plus RBIs, and say a 775 to 800 OPS, who is complaining? That's my question with how piss poor the DH position has been in years prior. So that's really my advocate as to why it should happen. There's a reason why the Mets have been active in these markets. Recent reports have indicated that we shouldn't expect the Mets to get in a bidding war for a short-term fit. You know, basically, if the Diamondbacks or the Angels say, hey, JD Martinez, we're going to give you 2 years with a third-year option, you basically kiss that idea goodbye if you're as Mets fans. Justin Turner is one where I think could still be appealing on a one-year deal. But my question with JT is how much interest level at this point in his career does he have coming to a Mets team that is not looking like that they're going to be even remotely close to the top team in their division? That's
the biggest thing.
Yeah, same thing
It's
with JD
it's
Martinez.
bigger than that too. It's like we're fully admitting that we're not fully going for it this year. You're going to be hitting in a park where it's known to be very, very unfriendly to hitters. And there's also a huge implication that you might get traded halfway through the season, and nobody likes getting traded. So I just think those are 3 massive contributing factors that, even if the Mets were to be the highest bidder, which they've already exclaimed that they're not going to be, would work against them bringing in one of these marquee power bats, which are going to probably get paid more than you'd see in a traditional market because there's such scarcity with power hitting position players in the free agent market. So I think if anything's going to happen, it's going to be some sort of crafty trade, which, you mentioned Eloy at the top of this, and I don't think I would mind that at all if that guy can stay healthy, because that guy's got monster power. And there are guys like that all over the league that the Mets can try and go find, but I don't see the free agent thing happening.
Yeah, I understood. And Jorge Soler is the interesting one. Whether you're talking to Joe DeMeo or Little anyone, they will tell you Jorge Soler is the guy to get. And I find myself in that category too. I love the fact that he is athletic. So if you need to put him in the corner every once in a while, I will stomach that. I just don't want him starting every day in left field for obvious reasons, right? DH-wise, though, he has by far, I think, the most upside power-wise. You're looking at him and Pete Alonso, 250 home run caliber bats in the same lineup that can do wonders for this team. Yes, he's going to strike out at a decent clip, but honestly, when you look at his advanced numbers, like his peripherals, they're pretty impressive given the type of power hitter that he is versus looking at power hitters as a whole in Major League Baseball. He doesn't have anything where you're like, oh my God, this is horrendous, we shouldn't consider him. His biggest downfall is his defense, but the upside is all there with the offense. Yes, he's looking for a multi-year deal. That's why he opted out of his deal with Miami. That's probably the biggest demise as to why the Mets won't land him. But what I will tell you is that there has been some recent info that I have heard that I'm going to expand on tomorrow, which indicates the Mets have been active in the Soler market. I'm not certain if they currently are, but they have been this offseason. So I'm going to expand on that a bit more, what that may mean for the club and their potential pursuit for external options. But, Jorge Soler would be fantastic. Rhys Hoskins. Personally, I want nothing to do with Rhys because I can't get over his immaturity with Jacob Ram. And I know a very select few Mets fans.
I don't think he would. It would be such a weird sight
It would
too.
be
Him
so
in a
wrong.
Mets
It's like
uniform.
people that want Hector Neris. I know he's been great with Houston, but he, in my opinion, is like the tail end of Jeurys Familia. I feel like if he comes here, there's going to be those similarities. The Mets beat up on the guy when he, when the Mets
He
weren't
was
even
my
that good of a
favorite reliever to
team.
face. Oh my god! Every
Like
time he came in, it was great.
exactly, you know what I mean. So for those reasons, I don't want Hector Neris. But when looking at DH bats, again, Rhys, a 1-year deal, guaranteed 20 plus bombs. I don't hate that. Same thing with Jock Peterson. Jock had an underwhelming past year, with the Giants, in which he's from the Bay Area, but still, though, it's an underwhelming class of bats in this free agent market. We're aware of that, but still, I truly hope the Mets can go out of their way to land one of these guys, because I think that while you can understand the upside in trying to see Mark Vientos play every day, I love Mark. I really think that there's potential there for him. I think there's also something to be said, too, though, about making sure that you put this offense in a position to succeed if you're claiming to be very competitive, pushing for a playoff spot this season, which Steve Cohen and David Stearns have actively said that's what they're trying to do. It's hard. They're in kind of this gray area from either being in black or white. Either you're all
Right.
in or you're not. They're stuck in the middle here, so it's been very interesting to see how the offseason has operated to this point. So we talked about DH, a lot of names out there. I know most Mets fans in here probably want them to go external, but if they go internal, don't be shocked. This is why we're talking about it, because it's very much a possibility for them. But now let's get into a much easier position to break down, and that is shortstop. Francisco Lindor, as long as he stays healthy, is going to basically play every single game. I know we got the one and only Joey Wendell that can handle some reps in the infield should he wish, but in all seriousness, this is Francisco Lindor's job, obviously. So my question to you, Jolly, is we saw Lindor have another fantastic year with the New York Mets. He's a lock to give you 30 bombs, 100 RBIs. He's been hitting solid from both sides of the plate. Yes, he had some underwhelming stretches throughout the year, but all things considered, Lindor is the best shortstop in the NL. In my humble opinion, you can make a rightful argument he's one of the best in the game still currently. So my question to you is, for Francisco Lindor, what is your expectation for him this season? Is there anything that maybe is different than his first couple of years in Queens, knowing especially that this is more of a transitionary year, labeled at least, versus saying, hey, we're going all in to win a World Series?
Yeah, for me, it might seem silly. I kind of want to see him get an Ironman season. He won 161 games in 22. He had to close the door on his finger. Last year, he missed just 2 games. I'd like to see him get all 162 this year, because outside of that, he's been an absolute dream these past 2 years, worth every penny, and well on his way to becoming one of the best players in franchise history. And I think that it's one of those scenarios, kind of like the Beltran contract, where people aren't going to realize how good Lindor will be for the Mets until the contract is set and done. So for him, it's just going to be maintaining, keeping yourself at the peak of your physical game. He's turning 30 this season. Sometimes that means a player improves in their 30s. We saw that with a guy like Adrian Beltre, who's probably going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer. But also sometimes you see a decline or a dip as soon as a player enters their 30s. So I think this season, the 4th year of this contract, will be very telling for the trajectory going forward for Lindor. But I have nothing but high expectations for him. I fully agree that he's the best shortstop in the National League. He proved that last year. Obviously, Seager had that magic run, but he didn't play all those games. He missed about 40 games. That's a quarter of the season, and that's pretty valuable at one of the hardest positions on the diamond. So Francisco Lindor, keep doing your thing, keep selling those jerseys, and keep asses in the seats, because there's not going to be a ton of reasons to go see the Mets this season if this is the team that we get on opening day, but he will definitely be one of them.
He absolutely will be. And final remarks I'll share regarding Francisco Lindor. It's not only the infectious personality he has, but everything he does. He does so many more things for the organization, which goes in hand, which why he's on the big contract that he's on. Himself, again, helping work with Mark Vientos already this offseason on his defensive game. Like, these are things that we need to take into account that he's very much apparent in doing. He's beyond active in the community as well, not only New York, but where he's from in Puerto Rico and Florida. I mean, all these different areas he's had a significant impact on. And my big thing for Francisco Lindor this year, and why I think we're really going to see a nice year from him too is he has the it factor. We haven't seen
Mm,
that with a lot of Mets with this current core group, the ability to step up in big moments. And I know you can make the argument the Mets really haven't had many big moment opportunities because if we're talking postseason play, all we have is those 3 wildcard games against the Padres to really reference, right? But still, if we look at just bigger moments throughout the season stepping up, Lindor has certainly done his fair share in that regard. He does not deserve nearly the flack he gets. And I think the biggest thing that always baffles my mind is look at how that trade has aged since then. That has been
right.
such a nice win already for the Mets. Andres Jimenez, again, had an awesome year last year, but he came back down to earth quite a bit. Even Jimenez at his best is likely going to be a high contact bat, similar to Jeff McNeil. If you're picking Jeff McNeil or Francisco Lindor, I think I know the answer to that 9 out of 10 times at least, right?
Yeah.
So Lindor, he has the it factor, he has the clutchness, and I'm really excited to see what he's going to have in store for his age 30 season. Penn Mets with a $20 donation, rather. Thank you so much. He says in 1986, the Mets platooned Wilson and Dykstra,
Yes, they did.
Backman, Toffel, and bullpen with Orozco and McDowell. Many role players such as Heap, Mazzilli, Howard Johnson. Yep, I can see Stearns and Wine the same type of team. Again,
Kevin Mitchell's in that mix too.
for
Like that
sure.
that whole team was a little bit ahead of their time, you know.
Yeah, it absolutely was. And when you look at, while the Mets, of course, had a star-stud pitching staff in large part, and they had those key guys offensively, they had the depth that got it done. The Mets were just such a scrappy team back then. They had their stars, but they had this nice mix of stardom and just guys that can go out there and get the job done, whatever you need them to do. You know, they had a lot of that scrappiness to them. And this Mets team, and I've been emphasizing this since last season ended, this team is automatically going to be more entertaining than last year. Even the
Yeah.
Mets, you know, when they won, they didn't win pretty. They had
Yeah.
very small stretches of like, wow, this is a team that you should warrant watching every day. I have to watch them every day as a fan and as a content creator, but if I was just a fan, there are some days where I'd be like, no, I'm sorry. Like,
I tuned
there's no
out.
point.
I tuned out some days for
Yes,
sure. I'm willing to
we
admit
all
it.
did for sure.
Yeah.
But this team, I think, with the lower expectations and new manager that we absolutely need to give some patience with, no one should be shocked if the Mets have some hiccups with Carlos Mendoza in his first year as manager. I think that's inevitably going to happen. But understanding that this is a team that's going to, you know, obviously have doubters heading into the year, but still has their core group, I really think that they're going to be an entertaining club that has a lot of, you know, hopefully promising offense. Yes, they might give up a decent amount of runs, but hopefully we see some more entertaining games at least where instead of, say, getting blown out 7-0, you win 10-8. Or, you know, you win 6-4, whatever it may be. So I'm looking forward to those matchups as a whole for sure. Thank you for that donation again, Penn Mets earlier. But we talked about shortstop. Now let's get into it. We talked about the outfield too. I think it's time for us to talk about, you know, the cream of the crop, the biggest focus in the show, and that is pitching. So do you want to start with the rotation or do you want to start with the bullpen? You tell me, Joe.
I think that we can do the bullpen first because it's kind of a brief discussion. I have I have a lot of apprehension about this roster. You know, we're not getting the sexy offseason that we got the past 2 years. There are question marks everywhere. But the one thing that I have full confidence in David Stearns to craft well and smartly is a bullpen because it's what he's been doing for the past 7-8 years in Milwaukee.
Right.
Year in and year out. He had the top end talent and guys like Hader and Williams that the Brewers developed. But year in and year out, you can click on any of those teams that had a winning record, go down to their bullpen roster, and you're going to see a name that you didn't expect to be there. Bryce Wilson last year, Hunter Strickland a couple years ago, Joel Payamps last year. These are guys that were pulled from around the league, whether they were free agents, waiver claim guys, throw-ins and trades, that the Brewers were able to transform and figure out an explosive pitch to make their primary weapon. That's what they've been good at for nearly a decade. And now he's doing it with much more resources. That's the whole thing with Stearns. He's coming here with more resources. So when you look at this bullpen on roster resource and you see Drew Smith in the third highest spot and Michael Tonkin and Phil Bickford, it's not going to jump off the page. But the moves have gone beyond just the guys that are slated to be projected on the major league roster. I think this Mets team, with the rotation that they have currently, which we're going to get into, is going to rely a lot on their relievers in 2024. And that's going to mean taxi squad guys going up and down with options, and some of the guys that got major league contracts like Jorge Lopez and Austin Adams. These are guys that can get fully enriched with the Mets pitching staff, specifically Jeremy Hefner, who I think we're going to be expecting a lot from this year to carry the load. So the bullpen, it's not going to be sexy, but I fully expect the Mets to have a plus bullpen this year. And even for most of last year, they had a decent work out of the bullpen up until they had to trade some of those guys like David Robertson, and then things began to fall apart. But yeah, Edwin Diaz is coming back. That's exciting. Drew
Kind of a big
Smith.
deal.
Drew Smith figured out, like, I don't know, man. It's now or never. It kind of should have been now or never last year.
Right.
And the one guy I think I'm most excited for is Jorge Lopez. He had a great 2021. I think he's still got plenty left in the tank, and he's a very good guy. So I'm rooting for him.
There you go. He's a good guy. And to add on top of that with Lopez, we all saw what he did in the World Baseball Classic for Team Puerto Rico.
Right,
Like, we all see
right.
this stuff. He had his struggles this year. I know that when he actually went back to Baltimore towards the end of the season, he changed up his arsenal a little bit in his usage. So there's been
Yeah.
changes in his game. We all know fastball velo. He's one of the best average flamethrowers in baseball. It's just around 97, 98 on the heater. Could give you triple digits without a problem. The Mets, and again, it might not seem like a big deal, but the Mets not having thrown one pitch at triple digits in their pen last year is kind of important. And the reason for
Yeah.
that is velo isn't everything, but velo factors into play here. And to not even have that remotely to the degree that they did in 2022 because of the lack of Edwin Diaz and their other injuries and just the changes in the pen as a whole has certainly not boded them well that we've seen. There's a few guys in the said pen who I trust. Of course, is headlined by Diaz, who I'm expecting to take a little bit of a step back this year. I'm not expecting Edwin to be 2022 Edwin. I'm expecting him to have some more inconsistencies. He's got to let the rust off, right? It wouldn't shock me if Edwin Diaz, maybe has a pretty piss poor month or so, and then he really gets back in the routine. So I have these expectations heading into the year with him. And outside of that, of course, Jorge Lopez has upside there. Brooks Raley, I absolutely love. I think when Billy Epler did that move to begin with, it was a smart one. The Mets finally have a southpaw, similar to when they had Aaron Loop that can come in and eat quality innings for them. And I do see a donation that I'll get into shortly here. But before I expand on relievers in the external market that I want to know, who are guys that you like in particular over others, I did want to make note of one thing that I forgot to mention from the DH discussion here, and that was Starling Marte, just briefly. Marte, the upside I seen him at DH is obviously to keep him fresh with his legs. The downside, though, is that unless Starling Marte can really hone into more of his power, you're still getting more of a gap-to-gap hitter at that position. Yep. So that is my biggest critique with Starling Marte. If he, does in fact become the Mets' everyday DH, I just hope that there's justified reasons for it and it leads to success and doesn't lead to failure, knowing that we just have him there for the sake of keeping him healthy while it can still have a negative impact on the club and their slugging as a whole. So that's what I'll leave you with. But there's 8 relievers. There's 8 or 9 relievers in this market that I really like for different reasons. I'm going to list them now, Jolly, and you tell me if out of these which ones you like, or if you have other guys in mind, please let me know and go ahead and share. So obviously it starts with David Robertson. I think you bring him back on a 1-year deal to be your true setup. I don't hate that at all. My only question is, what is David Stearns' interest level in pursuing D-Rob versus Billy Epler? Because this is the same David Stearns that had Adam Ottavino walking into his office to start the offseason saying, hey, let's restructure my contract. David says, nah, see you later. He's literally doing S&Y segments. It's nuts. And I like Adam Ottavino a lot. I do. And he still would be a solid reliever, but you can tell that they're going in a different direction. This is the David Stearns way. David Stearns is not the type of guy that's going to consistently get the sexiest name in the pen market because relievers are made year after year. They change so much. Again, no one expected Aaron Loop to have a .95 ERA when the Mets signed him, and yet he did. That's just one of endless examples of relievers. They're usually roller coasters. You have a low year, you have a high year. They go back and forth all the time. But it's
how much money did Aaron Loop get from that year?
Too much.
Did he get like 20 million or something? Something fucking crazy.
It was absurd. Absolutely absurd. That same season, Loop was saying by the deadline, basically like his regrets. He wished he stayed in Queens. Like it really is insane. But so we know that bullpen construction consists of not only, the sexy names in the free agent market, but how can you properly develop? What are you able to find in these guys? David Stearns, one thing we have seen so far this offseason and who he's acquired, either major league talent or especially a lot of these minor league signings with invites to spring training. Something that a lot of them have in common are like nasty sliders, where that's a high slider rate. They see a nice swing and miss. They might have an absolute cheeks fastball or a really piss poor breaking ball, but they have a nice pitch, and that's what Stearns wants to see what they have and if they can work with that. That's what the Tampa Bay Rays do. That's what we've seen, of course, with the LA Dodgers. All these superior analytically involved organizations, that is how they stay strong with their pitching labs each year. And now we look at the guys currently available outside of David Robertson. A couple guys to keep in mind. Yariel Rodriguez, I think, is an outside looking in now because the Mets basically have those types, unless you want to view him as, say, a 1 or 2 inning reliever, then, we can talk about that. Robert Stevenson, Matt Moore, Shintaro Fujinami, Phil Maton, Brent Suter, Ryan Stanek, and to a lesser degree now, because the Mets have, I think, their depth in Trevor Williams types, Jacob Junis. Out of those names, who do you like the most?
There are some sexy names there. if you want to find your eighth inning guy. And I
Right.
think the one that I think every Mets fan wants is David Robertson, just because it's kind of a nice story. He comes back. He didn't want to get traded to Miami, and it turned out to be a really good trade for the Mets from the outset. We'll see how Vargas develops, but he's looking like he could be a slam dunk. And you're getting that for a rental reliever, but I digress. I'm getting off topic. Like you said, a lot of those guys have certain tools that the Mets can really enrich and enhance, whether it's just the one pitch or the velocity. They've been focusing on the sinker ballers, guys that throw hard, all that kind of stuff. I don't know if you mentioned him because we went through a lot of names there. There's a guy that has a higher price tag than all of them, I'd assume, because he's young and he only very recently unlocked his potential, in my opinion. And that is Robert Stevenson,
Yep, I
who
did
was
mention
a
Robert
you
Stevenson
did
from
mention him.
Tampa.
Okay.
Yep.
So he was a highly touted prospect with the Reds for a long time. They were never really able to figure it out. He had some injury struggles as well. Wasn't even really good in the first half of last year. Came over from Pittsburgh to Tampa Bay, which is the pipeline from Tyler Glasnow, Austin Meadows. It's kind of a bad memory for Pittsburgh fans, so apologies there. And he just looked like he figured things out completely. He's one of these relievers that has a starter pitch mix, which is always super, super fun and really a huge advantage, even if you're one of these multi-inning guys, because you can constantly keep hitters on their toes, especially if one pitch is not working. You can just rely on something else. 90th percentile fastball velocity. He's one of these short arm guys, kind of like Lucas Giolito, which I've always found very interesting. And there's just a lot to like and gush over with him. He's a cutter guy, slider, split finger, and we like splitters over here with Kodai Senga. And it looks like he's still on the younger side, 30 years old. It looks like he's finally started to click. And I'd be really interested in a multi-year deal for him because I think that it's just scratching the surface for him. I think that the Mets can get in on the ground floor of a guy like this and have him for this 2-year window that they're planning. He reminds me a lot of Robert Suarez or Nick Martinez, some of the guys that the Padres signed to those longer-term deals, which were reformed starters with enhanced pitch mixes who turned into great relievers. And they were willing to pay a decent price tag on them. And the Padres, I think, are a good model in general. They spent another offseason investing a ton into their bullpen, which I think is going to work out for them. So I think he's the guy that intrigues me the most. And he's one of these guys that has a higher price tag. And I think the Mets aren't going to shy away from him. I think they're going to be involved in this bidding war. I'm curious to see how long it stretches out because I think any team could benefit from having him on their roster. But I think he'd be my ideal pick.
So my only concerns I ever have when it comes to acquiring relievers from the Rays, and this held true when we acquired Brooks Riley, I had in the back of my mind, even though I was excited about him. Riley, Colin McHugh, these are guys, again, that have been overseas, that were initially starters. They come back and they become really solid relievers. And my concern is Tampa does a fantastic job at churning something and nothing into something every single year. Is Robert Stevenson going to find himself in that category where he basically already hit his peak, knowing that Tampa unlocked parts of him that maybe other organizations will struggle to, even if he has the intel? Let's face it, the Mets are not in an analytical position the way that the Tampa Bay Rays are. Most teams aren't in the position that the Rays are, excluding, the LA Dodgers because they have Freeman over there. So that's another thing that comes into play. The guys can have the stuff, but do you have the proper personnel around him where you know that these projections are going to hold true? I'm a firm believer that if Robert Stevenson goes back to Tampa, we're probably going to have another very similar year for him. But if, say, he goes to, the Cincinnati Reds, it's not going to be the same because of a bunch of different external factors that come into play. So Stevenson, I would absolutely love him to come to the Mets. A multi-year deal would be interesting too if we see David Stearns do something like that for the pen. I think that might be wishful thinking given how he's operated at this point, but there's still so many great arms available in the market that you really are left wondering what is David's big plan here. If he's going to acquire one or two more prominent names, who are they going to be? Matt Moore, Brent Suter, I would love either of them. These are two guys that, again, they can both start, they can both relieve. Moore has more velo on the fastball, sits around 95. Suter, not known for the heat, but he's known for all the off-speed and breaking stuff, and he gets a lot of soft contact, gets ground ball rate. Fantastic.
Suter also a Stearns guy as well. He was with the Brewers. Stearns traded him before, so there's something
during
there.
their time in Milwaukee, and he just had a really good year with the Colorado Rockies. If you can do that with the Rockies, I'm already appealed by the idea of acquiring someone like you. So those are two lefties I like. Phil Maton, Ryan Stanek, two guys I would love too. Again, Maton doesn't have the velo, but he has all these other factors in his arsenal which are appealing. Stanek, again, a little bit of a rubber arm, can eat a lot of innings for you. do, and again, pretty effective in doing so. I know James Shiano, a good friend of mine that you know, is very much on the Stanek level as well. He loves that
Nice.
idea. That's like the
I
guy for
trust
him.
his pitching opinions. He knows his stuff. So
Exactly.
Stanek,
He's the pitching guru in our space.
I'm down.
I'm 100% on the wavelength with you. Shintaro Fujinami, another offseason where I want him. Yes, I know that he still has yet to figure his game out fully. But if this is a Mets team that, again, is kind of in this little bit of a figuring out what we have year, by all means, bring in a guy who easily touches 100 on the gun, has nasty off-speed pitches. It's just about putting it all together. He was able to for a small stint with Baltimore, but it didn't hold true throughout his entire time there after being dealt from the Oakland A's. From there, again, Yariel Rodriguez is a really fascinating name. He's a reliever in the MPB, not last season, but the year prior, multiple years. You know, he's a starter term reliever, but he started games for Team Cuba in the WBC, looked pretty solid. His build, for whatever reason, reminds me a little bit of Taijuan Walker. I don't know if it's just the stature or what, but I see some similarities there. A potential multi-aim reliever for you who has a solid fastball, solid breaking pitches too, but he's a guy that's likely going to get a multi-year deal like Shota Imanaga, for example, and I don't foresee him coming here. But you look at the other names too. If there's one more I would probably advocate heavy for out of them that I didn't touch on too much, prior to Sean Manaea, it would have been Jacob Junis. If you look at his peripherals through Baseball Savant and his advanced numbers, he's pretty good, but he's more so pretty good in the role that we've seen now and kind of what Manaea has been able to do. And in Junis's case, not a guy that I'd expect to be in as a starter, but again, if the Mets are in the market for another type innings eater that again has some plus stuff, Junis falls in that
pretty
category.
good last year. Not on my radar.
Very surprising. And I actually want to give a huge shout out. I believe his name is Daniel Wexler. Most Mets fans know him in the Twitter space. The guy's tweeting every 5 minutes about something Mets related, and he's been a heavy advocate for Jacob that I've found recently on Twitter. And I was like, wow, yeah, you're absolutely right. There's most certainly something there with Junis. So just another name to keep an eye on. But for me, I want the Mets to make sure that they can land a high leverage guy. So if that is in fact a David Robertson, I'd be very happy. I would not be opposed to Phil Maton or any of the other names that I mentioned there. But Ryan, I do see what the $5 donation earlier says. I'm not mad because I trust the process, but it's depressing knowing this is a 70 to 75 win team in January. It's what happens when Epler was your GM. So whatever look, there's a great debate to be had with Billy Epler with things he did right and things he did wrong. I think there are certainly some things that he did right that went in hand because of Steve Cohen kind of being a driver too. I think we also need to remember Steve Cohen has played a massive factor in a lot of the Mets moves since he became owner. And truthfully, his lack of knowledge with having the proper personnel from the beginning does play a part. Like Sandy Alderson, at the helm for the first year, that played a factor in the Mets' lack of success. You look at Zach Scott, Jared Porter, then you get on to Billy Epler. There are moves that made sense, but also it was just for the sake of spending and going after some of the biggest names out there in the free agent market. Cohen has since learned from that, which I think is very appealing. And I will give credit where credit's due. Epler, while he struggled mightily, give the Mets proper depth structure, which was their demise in 2023 in large part. Him and Cohen were able to have the understanding of saying, hey, it's time for us to change things. And if this was under the Wilpons, the Mets would have ran Scherzer and Verlander so into the ground, they would have been pitching in their grave. I kid you not. In their casket, they would still be in this Mets rotation. So for the fans out there that like to question Cohen ownership and things of that nature, you truly do not understand still just how vastly different things are and how different they're going to continue to be. I see Alberto with a $10 donation too. He says, hey, Wardy, I was wondering if you think the Mets can afford both Soto and Polar Bear with all the money coming off the books next offseason. Thank you for your content. Best on YouTube. Appreciate that a lot, Alberto. Thank you so much. I think you and I are probably both on the same wavelength. They can. It's a matter, will they?
I know which one I prefer. Sorry, guys.
I know which one I prefer too, and no one wants to hear it.
No one wants to talk about that.
It's the same thing as Lindor and McNeil in the sense of like who are you picking? If we're putting emotion aside, it isn't even much of a discussion. And this is someone who loves Pete Alonso, wants him to be a Hall of Famer with the Mets cap there. I want him to retire a Met. But if it comes down to the two, if you're talking about age, upside, projection, everything favors Juan Soto. So we're going to have, that's a great comment. I talked about it a little bit this offseason. That's going to be a huge debate as we get into later in the year. Should Alonso not be extended? Because
we talked about Yamamoto being the first New York bidding war. No, if the Soto extension doesn't happen, it's going to be the Juan Soto bidding war. I'm excited for it. It's going to be nerve-wracking at my office.
Yes. Oh my God. Especially if the Mets do somehow land him. I mean, and say
I'm not gonna be
so.
able to come in.
And Soto would say, "How did you know what this reminds me of, John? Back in fifth grade, my math teacher, huge Eagles fan, and I'm a Steelers
Yeah.
fan. So anytime he could, he loved to rag on the Steelers. My Steelers lose the Super Bowl that year.
Yeah.
I do not go to school the next day. How could I? I mean, I'm bedridden. I mean, you might as well think I have the flu. I went through everything. Watched every single game, every second, had my heart broken. First full year as a young football fan, watching every
Yeah.
game, mind you. So that really stung. Coming the following day, my teacher with a smirk on his face, he's like, "What happened to him?" I'm like, I wasn't feeling
No,
well.
jerk.
Yeah, he dragged it for a solid 5 minutes
Jerk.
to
You're
begin
like
the
10
class.
years old. Leave
Yeah,
him alone.
I know, but he had to
Jerk.
do it to me. It is what it is. But point
Yeah.
is, it's going to be fun to see how those debates happen later into next offseason. But
We will
we're
see.
we're still in this offseason, so let's round things out with the most important question of all. Are the Mets done adding to their starting rotation? Well, Salmon a day or two ago said yes. Mark Feinsand says no. Mets are still very active in the trade market, according to the recent reports. I did a short video on it. Check it out today, guys, if you haven't already. But expand on this more here. The Mets are still active, and people are wondering, are they going to acquire another depth starter? While it's possible, I think there's a fair argument to be had. Why would they do that via trade when there are still depth starter options in the free agent market? Especially if it's short term. What is the true appeal there? Unless maybe you get creative. There's one guy that I think could be very unique, but Boston, I'm sure, is reluctant to part with him. Nick Pivetta. Like, that's one name that I think could be very interesting if you're trading for a rental starting pitcher. But outside of that, Corbin Burns, Shane Bieber, it ain't happening for obvious reasons. So when you look at the current guys out there in the trade market, who is most appealing to you and why?
Well, from the top, I said this before the show. It's weird because I trust both Will Salmon and Mark Feinsand. I think they're both
Right.
credible reporters. I take their reports very seriously. So the
Yep.
fact that they're contradicting within this close of a range is very confusing, especially because ever since Stearns has come in, we haven't had the leaks like we've had before in prior off seasons
Right.
to get fans excited or whatever. So this felt like a purposeful leak. Feinsand's report. It felt like the Mets are, I guess, putting teams on notice, like, hey, we are very much still trying to be active and expand possibly into a 6-man rotation or put Hauser into a long relief or whatever it might be. I think they've set themselves up well for a trade deadline sell-off with basically everyone they've signed for the rotation, including Jose Quintana, who's in his last year. You have Quintana, Severino, Manaea with his opt-out, and then Hauser, who are all rental pieces. So if the Mets are going to add to this rotation, it's of my belief that it's going to be someone who is part of the larger plan, someone who
Right.
is part of the 2025, 2026 vision. The name that I am crossing my fingers for, that I don't know if it's going to happen because it's such a good contract. And I mentioned this to you, so you know who I'm talking about. I really hope the name that they're shopping is Stearns' guy, Freddie Peralta, who he was able to acquire from the Mariners for nothing in the Adam Lynn trade in 2015, one of my favorite why did they do that trades ever. Peralta's been great since coming up. He's made nearly 100 starts. He's had injury trouble, but when he's healthy, he's very good. He's got bullpen experience. He's bounced between back and forth. He's been something of a swingman. 210 strikeouts in 160 innings last year. That's an eye-popping number. The biggest reason why I want it to happen and why I think it won't happen is because Peralta's contract is awesome. This
It's
upcoming
too
year,
good for a small market team, especially.
right. It's a perfect contract for a team like the Brewers
Yeah.
to afford this great starting pitching. He's getting paid $5.5 million in 2024, which is a massive way down from his market value, which is probably closer to something like $20 million. He could earn another million in bonuses, whatever. In 2025, an $8 million option. That's a team option. So the team gets to decide whether or not they want to bring him back. Any team with the brain is going to bring back Peralta on an $8 million deal, even if he has a bad year, because a guy like Sevy, who had a terrible year last year, got $13 million. And then there's another $8 million team option in 2026. So you're potentially looking at 3 years of Freddie Peralta for about $20 million, who I would pay 1 year Freddie Peralta for $20 million. That's the caliber of pitcher he is when he's healthy. If the Mets can find a way to get that kind of deal done, if the Brewers are indeed going full fire sale mode, full sell-off, This is the kind of guy you want, a guy with multiple years of control, a guy that's been a swingman before, has done both roles, a guy with high strikeout potential, and someone that can be part of the long-term plan alongside Kodai Senga and whoever you decide to add next offseason. So if the Mets are trading for more starting pitching, it doesn't necessarily have to be Freddie Peralta, but it has to be someone that fulfills that category of multiple years of control. This is not someone we're looking to trade at the deadline. This is someone that's part of the larger picture.
Exactly. And I think in a large part, this has to do with, again, the demise of not landing Yamamoto. What was so appealing about him to begin with? It was age, it was upside, and projectability
Yeah.
for 2025 and beyond. If he was 30, I think it's a bit of a different discussion. I don't think the Mets go as hard for Yamamoto as they did. Truthfully, if they're staying true to what their plan is, we're going to push for a playoff spot in 2024, regardless of if it happens or not. And 2025 off seasons, where all hell's going to break loose, basically, with the money coming
Right.
off the books and them trying to really rectify and be a World Series contender on paper again, but hopefully in a better, more structured version than what we saw heading into the 2023 season. Peralta, I've advocated heavily for. I did a video on him not only right around a week ago or so on like 5 starting pitching targets for the Mets, and I had Peralta there as I think he was my number 1 option actually, because again, there's so much upside with him. He's young and multiple years of control, very favorable contract. David Stearns probably knows him best than any other exec in baseball outside of the Milwaukee Brewers organization. Again, rekindling that relationship. I love the fact that the Mets actually did a trade with the Brewers, it being a salary dump and on the receiving
Right.
end. I like that relationship is very evident. It's there, and I hope it continues. So Matt Arnold, throw us please. If Freddie Peralta, I'll give you a bag of baseballs personally, but I know we're gonna have to give
Please.
you a bit more than that. The biggest reason why I don't see it happening is one, the cost is going to be astronomical, and two, I'm pretty sure the Brewers like the idea of Peralta being their future ace should Burns walk after this season. And that's something that very well could be apparent. So Peralta, I'm in agreement with you. A couple other names to keep in mind. One that I think could be picking up steam sooner rather than later is Jesus Luzardo, right? This was a year ago that the Mets turned down offers for Jesus Luzardo because they wanted Brett Beatty, right? They
Yeah.
wanted Kevin Parada. I think if we look back in hindsight, a lot of Mets fans like the idea of doing that trade now, but do the Miami Marlins like doing that with the new guy at the helm at GM? I don't think so. So it seems that there's an interest level there for the Mets. We know that they are reportedly interested in Dylan Cease. I love Dylan Cease, not just because of his anomaly of a year in 2022. I think still Dylan Cease at 27 years of age, 2 years of control, the fastball. I know he lost a little bit of life. I know he lost some life and horizontal movement on his slider last year. I think there's still just so much potential in Dylan Cease that it warrants the prospect return, as long as they're not asking for a king's ransom the way that they were at the trade deadline just to fall flat on
Right.
their face. They should have traded him to Baltimore. They didn't. That was silly, the White Sox, but that, Southside's in disarray for a lot of different reasons right now. But
Yeah.
Cease would be an awesome fit, in my opinion. Not the best fit, but a nice fit for a bona fide top 3 starter. That's the emphasis. A guy that's still, in his mid to late 20s, multiple years of control, can be your number 1, number 2, or at worst number 3 for this upcoming season. So we talked about Jesus Luzardo. I think he'd be an awesome fit. Edward Cabrera, to a lesser degree, it's about staying healthy and getting his control down. But again, a wily arm that has a lot of swing and miss stuff that the Mets have been interested in the past. Another guy to keep in mind. What's the Marlins' interest level in trading the division? Not great, I'm sure. And Mets probably have to pay a little bit of a premium in order for it to happen. And I will just say this. One of the top beat writers for the Miami Marlins, I'm blanking on his name. I think last name's Mish. I'm blanking on the first name. I don't know why. He did just report, though, like a day ago, that Miami has like a big move, like coming very
Oh,
soon.
Craig Mish. Yeah,
Craig
he does a
Mish,
good
thank
job.
you. Yeah. He tweeted something along the lines like a day ago saying, a move's coming that's going to make a lot of fans happy, like soon. He's like, it's not imminent, but it's going to happen. Could that be Jesus Luzardo related? I'm not entirely sure. And we know that David Stearns has a stubbornness with parting ways with prospects, but not at the right price. If you're getting multiple years of control and back for a guy with plus stuff, that's going to warrant shedding a bit in the farm or even some controllable assets currently on the roster. Mark Vientos, for example, again, Florida native. Maybe he could be a nice DH first base split along with Josh Bell for the Miami Marlins this upcoming season. Maybe that's appeal. Not entirely sure, but something to keep in mind. I think if you're trading for Jesus Luzardo too, solid chance they want one of Jet Williams, Luis Angel Acuna. You got to take your pick. One of those I could definitely see being dealt, just in hypotheticals I've done in my mind here. But beyond that, you also look at, okay, there are a couple guys in Seattle not named Luis Castillo. I know he's been in trade rumors, but do the Mets really want to trade for a 31 Castillo already 1 year into his new long-term deal? I don't think he fits the bill of what they're looking for, right? But they do have some young talent in that rotation that can certainly be appealing. But I think one of the more interesting ones that has recently been brought to my attention, shout out again to Jordan Simpson, our least favorite pitcher in 2022, Mitch Keller. 2 years left to control.
Yeah.
He's got the stuff. I know you don't love him. But what's your thoughts about the Mets considering, again, Dylan Cease, Jesus Luzardo, Eduardo Cabrera, Mitch Keller, a couple of the guys from Seattle? If I'm missing anyone, please enlighten me, folks. But those feel like the names that, again, fit the bill of what you mentioned. Again, young, upside, multiple years of control.
Yeah, I think Dylan Cease is obviously, I think, the marquee name. I think he's going to go to a big player. I don't think it'll be the Mets, but you can't rule out anything like that, especially if you solve your DH problem in that trade as well. I think the Pirates would be fools to trade Mitch Keller because I think he's really starting to unlock his potential. I know Mets fans have animosity towards him, but me and him are good friends. We follow each other. We DM sometimes.
Oh, there you
I'm a
go.
Mitch Keller fan.
He's
So
your
if he
best
did
friend.
come over, I'd be very, very happy because he's a fan of John Boy Media. And then beyond that, yeah, it is kind of it's a little bit of the Marlins situation. They have this plethora of starting pitching that we're all very familiar with at this point, and the Mets could really benefit from even one of those names, one of those young fireballers. And they still have more guys in the pipeline, too, and Max Meyer, who we haven't even really seen and is supposed to be better than all of these guys.
Where's Sixto
Not
Sanchez?
to mention,
That's my question.
Sixto's gone. No one knows where he is. He's on a distant island. He's never to be seen again. And we thank him for his service. So I could see any of those as being pretty feasible for the Mets. The problem is that a lot of these starters are kind of on these teams that are in the middle pack, like the 10 through 20 teams is what I consider. The Reds, the Pirates, the Giants, teams like that have this pitching but aren't necessarily in a position where they need to part ways with it for any reason. And all the upper echelon teams are trying to stockpile as much starting pitching as they can. So you're left with kind of thin options on the trade market as well. But they all fit the bill of what I was mentioning before of this 2 to 3 year window with control, because starting pitching is more expensive than it's ever been. And it's not going to be going down in price anytime soon, especially with another weak market coming up in free agency next year. So I think that the Marlins route is probably the most likely. It's just a matter of, will Peter Bendix want to trade with a rival as basically his first move as a GM, which, could rub fans the wrong way, especially after you finally got them to come back out to Marlins Park last year by making the playoffs. So with that being said, I don't know. The report confused me a lot today, because if that Feinstein report didn't happen, I wouldn't be trying to draw up what the Mets are thinking in the trade market. I'd be saying they're done. The rotation is set. This is what they're doing. So this report has definitely thrown me for a loop, and it's got me thinking there's some kind of trade coming with maybe one of the names you mentioned.
And I'm just praying that the Mets do pull off a trade, even if it's, again, at the end of the day, another more mid to back end option, because I think the Mets are for certain going to roll with a 6-man this season. That I feel pretty confident saying that. But even if they do that, I just hope they do, because then it's going to be another situation where it's like, of course, we hear contradicting reporting. We're kind of getting our hopes up, and then they drop down. The reality is we don't land anyone, right? So I'm really hoping, just for the sake of staying true on reporting to it becoming reality, that is in fact the case here with Feinstein's thing, because I was still am mentally prepared for Sean Manaea to be, the last piece of the puzzle for the rotation, but very little people are happy about that, and I agree with the people that aren't happy about that. I see the issues. We know that the 4, and I tweeted this earlier today, and honestly, a lot of people made good points, because I just tweeted saying, the 4, it's certainly not the worst thing imaginable. There's some upside there, and when I meant 4, I think I was meaning it more so in just the career norms of these guys versus it being the absolute worst that they've been. So if we're evaluating it on, their lack of success in the Severinos of the world, the Manaeas in 2022, etc., then I can understand the 4 is not great. And the ceiling isn't great either. But I think there's that fine middle where there's a great reality that all these guys that are in the Mets rotation right now could easily give you anywhere from a 3.5 to a 4 ERA this season. I know that's not sexy, but the Mets can go from eliminating these 5, 6, 7 ERA guys down to north of 4. That's going to have a drastic difference on the makeup of the rotation throughout the entirety of a 162. And as we said it all along, it just makes so much sense. The writing's on the wall. They are one more top starter away from kind of being at a comfortable level, or even if they are sellers at the deadline, that's okay, because you still have a guy you have a couple of years of control in. And for the people saying, the Mets are just operating for the sake of for certain selling at the deadline, farthest thing from the truth. The upside with having short-term options is, again, if you're in a position where you are a borderline playoff caliber by the deadline, Mets are going to buy. If the Mets are in a position where, say, they're 8 games below 500, like last year, they're going to sell. But this is where things get really interesting, Jolly. Before we get on to answering that donation earlier for our final segment of the show, at what point do you draw the line in the sand? Because the Arizona Diamondbacks in 2023, the Philadelphia Phillies in 2022 proved that even if you were underwhelming in large parts throughout the vast majority of the season, especially in the second half, as long as you stay afloat above 500 and crack that wild card spot, anything can happen. So if the Mets are in a position where, say, maybe they are 4 or 5 games out of a wild card spot by the deadline, there could be an argument, depending on how the club is looking performance-wise, that they should still be buying, trying to go all in. What do you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, as a baseball fan, if my team is at a position where they're at least keeping their head above water, then I want to see them go for it, even if it's what you might consider a fruitless year where they're not truly putting all their resources for that specific season. Listen, man, like one of my favorite teams ever is the 2016 Mets, who basically fell ass backwards into the top wildcard spot.
James Loney, baby.
Putting James Loney, Ty Kelly, TJ Rivera out there every day. Those were AAA, quadruple A guys who came up and they put the pieces together and they got hot at the right time. There's no reason why it can't happen for any team like the Arizona Diamondbacks did last year. When you look at them on paper, that was not a World Series team. I don't think anybody thought that. And with the Mets, just a couple things need to turn their way. The rotation, one, needs to stay healthy. If we're going with reclamation projects, there is a world where every reclamation project clicks, like the 2021 Giants that I mentioned at the top of the video. Anthony DeSclafani was a nothing pitcher for his entire career. He came over to the Giants, made 30 starts, and finished top 10 in Cy Young voting. You could have a Sean Manaea season like that. Adrian Hauser could throw 200 innings. He's a ground ball specialist. All these things can happen in a vacuum in an 162-game season. And I think what the Mets are doing with the load management in the outfield, with McNeil's utility and keeping the DH spot open and fluid and getting all these different relievers with options that can come up and down on a taxi squad, is they're giving themselves the chance to stay healthy for a full 162, which is essentially what undid them last year in June when everyone got hurt and everyone started underperforming and they had to run out the same bad lineup every day. You can avoid that kind of thing with options. And it's not the best talent on the market, but it's athletic talent, it's younger talent, it's faster talent. There's run prevention all over this lineup now in the outfield and stuff like that. They're going for a new look. And that's why I'm kind of excited, because who knows? Yeah, maybe the team might end up being mediocre. They sell off at the deadline again. They get pieces for 2025, whatever. Or you end up on the other side where you get a really fun kind of one-off season where the Mets might stumble into that 6th seed in the wild card, and who knows what might happen from there. We've seemed to always see these lower-seeded teams go off and make crazy runs. There's no reason why it can't be this Mets team, because there's major league talent, whether you agree with it or not. There's major league talent from top to bottom on this team now. There are no fringe players. These are major league players who got signed to major league contracts on this roster. Let's see if they can execute. Who knows?
My final remarks from that is, to your point, yes, there's a good possibility at least that everything kind of goes as planned with what Stearns is building. Of course, there is a possibility where things don't go as planned. Luis Severino is cooked in the first month of the season, right? Adrian Hauser's fastball is a meatball. Like, a lot of things could happen. And I think, not that I wish it, and I'm knocking on wood right now, I think part of the reason why the Mets have an emphasis on still hopefully trying to land another bona fide top 3 is Kodai Senga's health. And I know he was healthy all of last season. Awesome. Love that for Kodai. Let's not forget, there's a Tommy John clause in his contract purposely because he's had a lot of wear and tear on that UCL. I mean, literally, if you look at what happened during his time, he was pitching a decade in the MPB, a professional level, where he's eating a lot of innings. He has, if I'm not mistaken, around a partially torn UCL, but it's not overly concerning should that be the case as long as it doesn't fully rupture, because we've seen a lot of guys, again, continue to perform, especially at Senga's level was remarkable last year with the wear and tear. But if, say, he gets to the point of having a partially torn, if it's not already there, think of Masahiro Tanaka as that potential hope, where you pitch your entire career at the MLB level with it, and you're still very productive every fifth day starter in doing so. But let's keep in mind, there is a reality where some of our favorite players are going to falter. How are you going to be able to fill in those holes? You're not going to be able to do it perfectly, but are you able to have a proper adjustment than, say, having Denny Reyes being in your rotation in the first month of the season? That is the difference here that I want to emphasize with everybody. No more Jared Eichhoffs. This is why the Mets are doing what they're doing is to have protection. Where even if say, hey, they're a bit underwhelming, at least they have a better chance to stay in ball games versus throwing out guys that absolutely have no right to be out there on the field. That's a difference, and that is what I'm looking forward to for this upcoming season. So, final things before we get out of here. Eric McDermott with a big donation earlier that we want to address. He says, hey, gents, curious about the following prospects, players, and which category you put them in. Untouchable, trade in the right deal, or trade in any deal. McNeil, Marte, Parada, Vientos, Acuna, Clifford, Vassell, and Scott. A lot of interesting names out there from not only the players on the roster, but guys in the farm. So, I'll respond to this first, Jolly, and then I want to hear what you have to say about this. We got McNeil, Marte, Parada, Vientos. So let's start with the untouchables. Out of that entire group that I just looked at, none of them are untouchable. In my humble opinion, none of them whatsoever. As much as I like Luis Angel Acuna and his upside, I have very little issue trading him away if that means the Mets get a Jesus Luzardo type. I think that makes a lot of sense, not only because of Acuna's current talent level, but also knowing that the Mets do have two guys that very well could be the future at second base. Whether that continues with Jeff McNeil or that goes to Jet Williams, they have a bit of a logjam there, which warrants my reasoning for saying making such a statement. Jeff McNeil, I think, is very much along the wavelengths of like trade in the right deal, not in any deal, but trade in the right deal. I don't think there's anyone that you just trade in any deal. I think that's a silly. Right. I don't know what the context of that is. I know he probably didn't mean in the sense of just throwing them away, but I'm not willing to give away Jeff McNeil for nothing. If you're going to trade him, especially after coming off of a down season, you're not going to get too much of in return. I think if McNeil is dealt, he could be part of a larger deal where it makes sense, where the Mets have protection at second base. And again, they're getting something larger, and McNeil was just kind of that piece where it rounded things out, if you will. So that's my stance on that. Kevin Parada, same applies. You trade him in the right situation. Parada is now in a farm where he was deemed initially as a Mets top prospect, and he is. Didn't have the best year this past year that we saw there in Double-A, however, or at least it was High A. I don't know. Did he get to the Double-A level, Parada, or was he just
High A? He got a little at Binghamton. That's probably where he's going to start in 2024.
Right. Okay. So Parada's another one where, in the right deal, I think he makes sense. Again, looking back on Miami, for example, we've had interest in the past. Then we get on to Ryan Clifford in the right deal, but I would like the Mets to steer away from trading him, only because I think there's a lot of raw potential power there with Clifford. I like him a lot. When the Mets first traded for both him and Gilbert, Clifford was a high riser in the Astros prospect front. I mean, he literally came out of nowhere. It was not a high draft pick at all, and it was already finding themselves as what the latest rankings, according to MLB.com, indicated their number 2 ranked prospect. So Clifford, I think there's a lot of upside there with him. Vassell, Scott, I don't want to trade these guys unless it's the right deal, because the Mets need as much pitching depth as humanly possible. So if you're going to trade away either of these guys that are, on the verge of being an MLB caliber talent, where their ETA is right around 2024, 2025. If you're going to trade them, make sure it's for the right deal, where you're getting not only controllable talent back, but again, young upside. And again, this all goes in hand, in my opinion, with the starting pitching trade market that Stearns is currently evaluating. And then from there, Vientos, same applies. Right deal. I'm not going to put anyone in any deal category unless we find ourselves towards the end of the season, there's someone where it's like, oh my God, they're absolutely horrendous. Let's just get rid of this guy. Where do you stand regarding the following to McNeil? Marte, same thing. Marte, actually, does Marte fall in that category if you trade him away? I don't think you can do that. I really don't, even with that contract. But I think if you trade Marte away, you're getting very little in return. So if you want that return, given his contract, if you eat a boatload of that, it's pretty inflated. That's where I say it's almost like you're trading him away in any deal. But aside from that, Marte, McNeil, Parada, Vientos, Acuna, Clifford, Vassell, Scott, where would you categorize those players?
Yeah, I think I'm fully with you in the fact that none of them are untouchable. But it's exactly what you said with Clifford in the inverse. The Astros had a high riser in their system, a system that has produced a ton of great ball players in the past 10 years. They used that high rising year from Clifford and capitalized in a trade for a Hall of Fame pitcher, Justin Verlander. And the Mets can do that in the inverse if they're trying to buy as well. If you have a high riser and someone like Parada, who turns it around in 2024, or Luis Angel, who has a year to get comfortable and finally starts to show flashes of the player that he can be, there's no reason why the Mets can't capitalize and trade those guys. There's no sense in trading a prospect that is at their lowest value or is reaching higher levels and starting to struggle, because, basic 101 scouting is showing that these players might be capping out in their amateur career or their affiliate career, whatever you want to call it. So at the end of the day, the trades have to make sense. If it's a Marte trade, you're going to be eating all the money. You hope that if you've DH'd him enough, he's done enough offensive production to where a team wants him as a rental piece or whatever. There's a ton of implications with all of these names. Christian Scott, if he has a good showing at AAA, the Mets give him a couple tastes at the major league level, and they parlay that into some other piece. They have to be very smart with how they approach this. And that's why a guy like David Stearns is the kind of guy you want at the helm, because he's been on the right end of these trades more often than not in his career. He took a bad Hunter Renfroe season, traded him to the Angels, and got 3 relievers back, including Abner Uribe, who had like a 1.7 ERA for them, and he was one of 3 relievers acquired in that deal. If Stearns is a guy that can do this with, a bad rental season or a guy that's past his best years, then there's no reason why he can't maximize values in terms of doing it when the timing is exactly right. And the Mets have a ton of guys that should be on the table. In fact, the majority of their roster is probably on the table in 2024 outside of Edwin Diaz and Kodai Senga. And is there anybody else? I mean, don't really think so.
Lindor, obviously, just the guys with the long-term contracts, but that's
right.
few.
So
everyone else
pretty
is
much
expendable.
The majority of the roster will be in that category. So I'm fine with it. Just do it the right way. And it wasn't Stearns last year. I think Epler had a great deadline last year. I think he did it the right way. So I'm hoping that they continue that trend. And if it's all for building the farm system, I am for it.
Yes, and I'd like to make one more thing clear here. Just because I have a willingness to trade away with prospects does not mean that I want to. I had someone in the chat saying, "Oh, you trade away anyone in the farm." No, not anyone. I'm pretty stubborn, especially like with Jet Williams. I do not want to see dealt. But again, if it's the right team fit, if you're going after a young guy that has potential ace caliber stuff, and like a Luzardo, for example, a Peralta, I think that those things are warranted, even if Jet Williams hits his absolute ceiling of what he's projected to be. So that's something I like to make clear. It all comes into the little factors with said deal. I don't want to trade away most of these prospects for rentals as is. The only way I would even warrant that idea is if, say, the Mets really exceed expectations leading up to the deadline, and they're in a position where, if, say, they're just 1 or 2 missing pieces away, hence 2022 season where the Mets did not address the DH position properly enough. If they did it and did finally address those areas of need to the proper point, I can get the wavelength of trading away some young, talented prospects. But again, it's all dependent on the unique situation. I am not that guy that views himself as a complete prospect hugger, nor am I one that wants to deplete the farm for anything. If there's one thing my young Mets fandom has told me under the Bullpen and Brady Van Wagner regime, it is not a smart idea to just throw away prospects for the sake of throwing them away to try to be competitive for the remainder of the year and still not even crack postseason play. Right. So for all those reasons and then some, that's where I stand. And I know where you stand too, Jolly. So that is going to wrap up the show. I want to thank everyone so much for watching. You're almost an hour and a half into this. More long-winded than I expected, but a great discussion. Jolly, it's always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you so much for coming on. Before I let you go, please let people know where they can find you and what do you have in the works for your work at Jolly Olive.
Appreciate you, Wardy. I'm glad we went over. I always love coming on the channel. You do a great job. Shout out Grant in the chat. Congratulations on getting your account back.
Thank you.
Today
Appreciate
for
the
Jeannie.
donut, Grant. Shout out to you, Jenny Metz.
Yeah, you can find me at Jolly Olive on YouTube. We already mentioned it before. Closing in on 100K. Could appreciate your help if you want to go check out some of that content. I'm also Jolly Olive on Twitter, always tweeting about the Mets and stuff like that. And I got some fun Mets-related stuff that I get to announce at this time next week. Monday next week, I got a fun announcement. I can't tell anyone yet, but if you want to know what it is, follow me on Twitter, and it'll pop up in 7 days.
There you go. I'm excited to hear what the news is going to be. I hope you guys are too. Thank you all so much for watching. Check out Jolly, like you just said. Help him get 100K. Don't be selfish. Hit that damn subscribe button. Also, don't be selfish here too. If you like the content, help us get a 25K. We're only a couple 100 subs away. Greatly appreciate it. Thank you all so much for the support. As always, no matter the type of underwhelming offseason or an exciting one the Mets still may have on the horizon, we're going to be covering the club to a T on pretty much a